Well, good evening. I'm Ben Swann, and welcome to this special half-hour reality check. We are just about 10 days away from Super Tuesday and the Ohio Republican primary. And that is why tonight we are giving you a look at the positions of the 4 Republican candidates and where they stand on 3 major issues. Now, throughout the evening, you can tweet comments about this program to @Fox19 Ben Swann. I'll respond to some of those tweets throughout the evening as well. Now, we are taking a look at a new report on each of the candidates' proposed budgets, how they plan to cut the national debt, as well as the ongoing federal deficit. We're also talking about gas prices and what these candidates propose to do about the soaring cost of gasoline. And finally, we're looking at where these candidates stand on the threat of Iran. And to be clear, we are comparing notes based on the answers the candidates gave in Wednesday night's CNN Republican debate in Arizona. We also have invited Hamilton County Republican Party Chairman Alex Triantafilou to join us tonight so we can really break down each of these 3 topics and what Ohio Republicans are looking for. But first, our $16 trillion debt. You know, it's on the minds of a lot of voters. President Obama just unveiled his proposed $3.8 trillion budget, which includes about $1.7 trillion in deficit spending. It is the 3rd consecutive budget that runs $1 trillion+ deficit. So where do Republican candidates stand on their plans, and how would they reduce that deficit? Let's take a look. 4 Republican candidates and 4 different economic spending plans. A new report released by the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget in Washington has run the numbers, and here's what they found. All but one candidate's plan would actually increase the deficit.
Well, when I was Speaker, as I'm sure he remembers, we balanced the budget for 4 consecutive years for the only time in his lifetime.
Let's start with former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. His plan would add the most, with tax and spending policies that would actually increase the debt by $7 trillion by the year 2021. That's what the report says. Gingrich would reduce the government's income the most with his proposal to create a new 15% flat tax. That would cost the Treasury about $3.4 trillion, according to the analysis. Also, his calls to cut the top corporate income tax rate to 12.5% from 35%, to eliminate capital gains taxes and in the estate tax would cost trillions more. Now, his biggest spending cut is a proposal to reduce funding for the more than 100 programs benefiting the poor. That would save an estimated $2.4 trillion.
I put together a specific plan that cuts $5 trillion over 5 years, that spends less money each year for the next 4 years that I'll be President of the United States.
As for former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum's plan, well, according to the analysis, it would add $4.5 trillion. Santorum's plan would add to the deficit by reducing the number of individual income tax brackets to 2 from 6, with rates set at 28% and 10%. He would also eliminate the corporate income tax for manufacturers while cutting it to 17.5% for other businesses. Now, those proposals would together divert more than $5 trillion in revenue from the Treasury, according to the report. Santorum would make up some of that, about $500 billion or so, by adopting a Medicare voucher program similar to the one proposed by House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan.
Number one, I said today that we're going to cut taxes on everyone across the country by 20%, including the top 1%. So that's number one. Number two, I said, yes, we should increase the debt ceiling in this last vote, but only if we have a cut, cap, and balance provision put in place.
Now let's talk about former Governor Mitt Romney. Romney's plan would add $2.6 trillion by 2021, the group says. Though it also noted that the estimate is a little less certain here because many of the details of his tax proposals are pretty vague. His campaign said that the plan would not add to the deficit because it would replace the lost revenue by clamping down on individual tax preferences.
I argue for the case of the responsibility being on the Congress, but it's the responsibility of us who believe in fiscal conservatism to vote against the bill. We need to vote against the spending is what we need to do.
Now, the only plan that would actually cut the deficit, according to the report, that of Texas Congressman Ron Paul. Only Representative Paul's plan would more than cover the cost of his tax cuts with spending reductions, the group says. Paul also has proposed $5.2 trillion in tax cuts over the next decade and $7.5 trillion in reduced spending, which would cut the debt by 2021 by more than $2 trillion. By contrast, Paul's tax and spending plans would improve the budget outlook by marrying tax cuts with even larger spending reductions. He would cut defense spending, including ending immediately military operations in Afghanistan. He's also proposed eliminating 5 cabinet agencies and rolling back spending on Medicaid, food stamps, and other programs for the poor back to 2006 levels. So here's what you need to know. This is a tough issue, certainly. And surprisingly, many Americans seem to be tuning it out. You know, candidates talk about the threat of Iran and the threat of terrorism, but the amount of debt this country has accumulated at $16 trillion and rising, well, that certainly may be our greatest threat. In fact, this may be the single most important issue of the next 5 years at least in this country, because our deficit and borrowing is fast approaching a point of no return. Our money is on the verge of being worthless. Think about what that means. Americans have got to wake up, and that is Reality Check. Alex Triantafilou with the Hamilton County Republican Party here to talk about issues of the budget. How important is this issue, Alex, to Ohio Republicans?
Well, we have a tremendous budget deficit, and it sometimes feels like the American people are oblivious to what's actually occurring. This $16 trillion debt needs to be addressed. I think conservative Republicans are ready to address it where this president is not.
How do you go about addressing this? Because we were talking about this right now, and you know, when Governor Romney was here, I think it was earlier this week, he mentioned about wanting to, cut the deficit this year by $1 trillion if he were to take office. So that would be in 2013. And yet, he didn't give very many specifics. That is a huge number. Now, Congressman Paul, obviously, his plan is pretty detailed. But how do these other candidates put out a plan that clearly articulates how they would go about cutting at least $1.8 trillion starting off this next year in order to overcome and not be in that deficit spending from day one?
Well, it's a challenge, and a lot of these plans are not accounting for a growth in the economy that will generate more revenue. So your question is, how do they do it? I mean, I think the American people should demand a plan, not only of the Republican candidates, but of the president. And I'll tell you, the president's recent budget denied the reality of what's actually occurring with these budget deficits. So, look, I think you're right. Ron Paul does have an interesting plan. The challenge for someone like Ron Paul would be getting it through the Congress.
It will be very difficult to get it through the Congress. Obviously, that's been a challenge for the current president in working with the Congress as well. Let's take that graphic real quick, too. I wanted to show this to you very quickly, how the Ohio polls versus national polls are showing. Santorum right now, obviously, is up, Romney, Gingrich, and then Paul. In Ohio, he's polling at 9% compared to 11% nationally. However, this polling data is all before the latest debate. Do you think any of this will change after the debate?
Well, Ben, we've seen these polls go up and down and all over the place, and I think the most dangerous thing to do in this climate is to make any predictions, but I'll tell you that I think this thing is going to get very tight in Ohio, and I expect you'll see a very close race, really between Romney and Santorum as we come down to the wire.
Sounds good. All right, Alex, thank you for that. Stick around because gas prices, just ridiculous right now. Estimates that we could see $5 a gallon by summer. In fact, some parts of the country already are. So what would these Republican candidates do to bring down the price of gas? Is that the job of the president? Who's got a plan? Who doesn't? We tackle that next. Welcome back to the Reality Check special tonight. There is no doubt that one of the biggest issues in this year's presidential election will be gas prices. Already, we're seeing the highest prices in history for this time of year. So what will the presidential candidates, if elected, do about gas prices? Let's take a look. Well, there is no doubt that gas prices are hurting a lot of Americans. And if we really do see $5 or $6 gas this summer, it will cripple many families. So let's talk about what the candidates had to say during Wednesday night's CNN debate. Congressman Ron Paul says our current standoff with Iran and our intervention in Libya are partly to blame.
The neoconservatives who now want us to be in Syria, want us to go to Iran and have another war. And we don't have the money. We're already, today, gasoline hit $6 a gallon in Florida. And we don't have the money.
Well, actually, PolitiFact.com gave Congressman Paul a pants on fire for that statement, saying that gas is not at $6 a gallon in Florida. Though I checked into it, and according to GasBuddy.com, motorists are shelling out $5.89 for a gallon of regular gas at a Shell station in Lake Buena Vista. You can also find gas for $5.99 a gallon for premium. But that aside, the congressman is also correct that due to speculation in the market, every time Iran makes a move or the U.S. makes a move near the Strait of Hormuz, speculators raise the price of a barrel of oil. But what Congressman Paul didn't spell out was what specifically he would do to lower prices, other than calming the situation between the U.S. and Iran. And while that may lower prices somewhat, there's no guarantee on how low prices would actually drop. So what did Governor Mitt Romney and Senator Rick Santorum have to say?
So I want Governor Romney to come into the conversation. We'll continue it with everyone at the table. As we have this showdown, confrontation, call it what you will, with Iran, should our leadership, including the current President of the United States and the four gentlemen here with me tonight, be prepared to look the American people in the eye and say, and I want to hear everybody's plans, over the long run I think I can bring down the price of gasoline, or I can't if that's your plan, but at the moment we need to have a conversation about how, as long as this continues, the prices are likely to keep going up.
Look, the price of gasoline pales in comparison to the idea of Ahmadinejad with nuclear weapons.
Well, Romney and Santorum, they really did not touch on how they would deal with gas prices at all, though both candidates have been attacking President Obama as of late over the high prices, saying that if only he had approved the Keystone Pipeline, prices wouldn't be as high. As for Speaker Gingrich, he was much more specific on what he would do.
The energy issue is enormous. The leading developer of North Dakota Oil estimated recently that if we would open up federal land and open up offshore, you would have 16 to 18 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars in royalties to the federal government in the next generation. An enormous flow which would drive down prices to $2.50 a gallon, would help us balance the budget, and would create millions of jobs.
And the former speaker is correct that opening up North Dakota would bring in lots of royalties to the feds and could create hundreds of thousands of jobs, if not millions. But there is still no guarantee that prices would drop to $2.50 a gallon. And also no guarantee that prices would remain at that level for any significant period of time. And that's what you need to know. Right now, we've had a very mild winter, and there is no shortage of oil in the United States. In fact, we have a very large surplus of supply from oil being drilled here. According to Fox Business's Lou Dobbs, though, the problem is not supply. It's that oil companies are taking our oil right now that's being drilled in the U.S., and they're selling it overseas to China and India, while sticking American drivers with higher prices at the pump. There are a lot of factors that play into the price of gas, and the President of the United States may not have much control over the actual price. But none of the candidates, including President Obama himself, have really offered a solution to the problem of oil being drilled here being sold elsewhere. And that is Reality Check. So, Alex, how much are you hearing from Republicans in Hamilton County on the issue of gas prices? And do you think this is going to play a major role come the November election?
Well, we're hearing a lot. And, you know, as the prices have crept up recently, it's a concern. It's a concern for everyone, especially Republicans. Of course, we think that we ought to have a comprehensive energy plan. We feel like this president hasn't delivered one.
Do you think that in the event of, like, Speaker Gingrich, he's talking about wanting to open up for more exploration, more drilling, and obviously there's a lot of Americans, especially Republicans, who are really behind that idea. The problem, though, is if that is allowed to happen, and yet oil companies continue to sell that oil overseas and the prices do not dramatically drop here, is there a backlash that comes from the American people who say, well, what's the deal? You're drilling for oil on our land and selling it overseas?
Well, there ought to be a backlash because we need that energy here. So, you know, I hope to see somebody address these problems.
Talk to me a little bit about the position the other night. I'm sure you were watching the debate. Romney and Santorum really didn't touch on the issue much at all. How important is it, if either one of them are the nominee, to have a comprehensive plan for energy? They're not going to be able to skate by without one. Is that correct?
I absolutely agree. And look, we were having the same conversation as a nation 4 years ago. 3 years ago. I would argue that President Obama and his team really have not taken on the issue of energy and new energy exploration and finding new avenues of energy. So I hope that I expect the Republicans will have a plan. What about in terms of what Congressman Paul was saying about it, our foreign policy right now in the Middle East, certainly with what went on with Libya, what's happening now with Iran, how much do those factors play into the price of gasoline? And do you think Americans are willing to say, let's continue to operate as we have been and watch those prices continue to go up? Well, we shouldn't operate as we have been. I mean, for a generation, we've been talking about getting off of foreign oil. And, I mean, it's really a challenge for the next administration to do that. All right, Alex, thanks for that. So what is the #1 foreign threat to America? A new poll says most Americans say it's Iran. So what will the Republican candidates do about Iran? We're taking a look on the other side of this break. The argument over Iran during Wednesday night's CNN debate, one of the more interesting questions, wasn't asked by debate moderator John King. It was actually asked by Congressman Ron Paul to his opponents. But the question is really important, considering what President Obama has done for the past 2 years.
Well, over the past 24 months, the U.S. has operated under a military process of dropping bombs and flying Predator drones over certain countries that we're not technically at war with. But it's done under the guise of the war on terror. We've seen it in Yemen, where the U.S. has carried out the assassination of terrorist suspects, despite the fact that they're U.S. citizens. We've also seen it in Libya, where the U.S. spent over $1 billion flying missions and bombing parts of that country to help oust Muammar Gaddafi. And now the discussion for the Republican candidates is Iran. What to do with that country? For all intents and purposes, it appears that the U.S. is headed to war. So where do the Republican candidates stand on whether we go to war with Iran?
I believe in the Christian just war theory that you have to morally justify the war in defense. Now, if we're defending our country, and we need to defend, believe me, men and women will be in combat and defending our country, and that's the way it should be. But when it's an offensive war going where we shouldn't be, that's quite a bit different. So it's the foreign policy that needs examined.
But the other Republican candidates have a very different theory of war. Here's how Newt Gingrich responded to the question of the Iranian threat.
If an Israeli prime minister, haunted by the history of the Holocaust, recognizing that 3 nuclear weapons is a Holocaust in Israel, if an Israeli prime minister calls me and says, I believe in the defense of my country, this goes back to a point that Congressman Paul raised that we probably disagree on. I do believe there are moments when you preempt.
Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney echoed the sentiment of Gingrich.
Ahmadinejad having fissile material that he can give to Hezbollah and Hamas, and that they can bring into Latin America and potentially bring across the border into the United States to let off dirty bombs here. I mean, or more sophisticated bombs here. We simply cannot allow Iran to have nuclear weaponry.
I would say that if you're looking for a president to be elected in this country that will send that very clear message to Iran as to the seriousness of the American public, to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon, there'd be no better candidate than me, because I have been on the trail of Iran and trying to advocate for stopping them getting a nuclear weapon for about 8 years now.
And as you can see there, Senator Santorum on the same page. If you've been following the past 20 debates, those answers won't surprise you. Gingrich, Romney, and Santorum all believe in preemptive war. And they've all made clear they feel we should strike Iran in order to prevent the country from getting a nuclear weapon. Congressman Paul says there's no evidence that Iran has a weapon or is actually building one, and believes that the U.S. cannot afford to go to war again in the Middle East right now. But there is a bigger question here that the candidates did not answer.
Now, if they're so determined to go to war, the only thing I plead with you for, if this is the case, is do it properly. Ask the people and ask the Congress for a declaration of war. This is war, and people are going to die, and you've got to get a declaration of war.
And most people will have missed that comment, but it is the central point in the argument over Iran. You see, it's actually a poor question to ask the presidential candidates what they will do about the threat of Iran. And that's because the president isn't supposed to make that decision. It's up to the Congress, according to our Constitution, to make a declaration of war. Who are we fighting? Why are we fighting? How do we know when it's over? It's up to the commander-in-chief to carry out the war according to the declaration made by the Congress. So here's what you need to know. There has been a shift in recent years about the role of the president and war. After unilateral moves by President Obama in Libya, or even our role in NATO to help bomb countries without first the approval of Congress, well, it simply weakens the separation of powers put in place by the framers of our Constitution. And that is Reality Check. So, Alex, I want you to comment on this poll. We have this poll here that shows who is the United States' greatest enemy. It's a national poll. Number 1 coming in that list, obviously, is Iran at 32%, followed by China, North Korea, Afghanistan, and then Iraq. People that you're talking to and hearing from, how concerned are they about Iran?
Well, I think they're very concerned. I think what the candidates are saying is sort of echoing the views of most Republicans. We're concerned about Iran having a nuclear weapon and using it the way that the terrorists use it on 9/11.
While there are clearly concerns about that, I think the bigger point, though, here really is about the Constitution, about the process of this. Because what we've seen under President Obama is a president who has gone to war multiple times in different capacities. And because it's not a declared war, they'll say, well, they'll refer to them in different ways. Libya is a great example of that. Well, it was a deal with NATO where we were attacking and helping kind of the insurgency in Libya. how can that continue to fly and the Constitution remain intact?
Well, it's gone on for some time, and
it has.
I would tell you, as you know, the first Iraq war, there was actually a declaration that came out of the Congress. But look, I mean, Ron Paul has got a strong following in the GOP and elsewhere because he's trying to bring us back to these basic fundamental principles.
What do you think happens now with this question? Because we are seeing right now Israel gearing up for war, talking about going to war, Israel striking. Do you think that the Republican candidates are going to be able to get by on saying, well, I'll deal with Iran if it happens, we'll deal swiftly, we'll deal strongly, and have the Congress behind them? Do you think they'll go through the formal process? I guess in some minds it would tip Iran off of what we're doing if you make a declaration of war, and yet that is the law of our country.
Yeah, there needs to be some action here to defend this country against what Iran is doing. They cannot have a nuclear war, and I think all the Republicans are united on that score.
Terrific. All right, when we come back, some final thoughts and more of your tweets. We'll have them for you after this break. All right, some final thoughts here as we're closing up this reality check special with Alex Triantafilou with us tonight. Tell me, do you think we're going to have a brokered convention? A lot of people are talking about this.
I don't think we will. I certainly hope we don't. I think as the next couple of Tuesdays happen, we'll start to get more clarity.
Clearly on Super Tuesday, a lot of questions may be answered. A lot of questions may be still out there.
They'll be answered right here in Hamilton County and in Cincinnati, Ben.
All right. Thanks for being with us. Most with tax and spending policies that would actually increase the debt by $7 trillion by the year 2021. That's what the report says. Gingrich would reduce the government's income the most with his proposal to create a new 15% flat tax. That would cost the Treasury about $3.4 trillion, according to the analysis. Also, his calls to cut the top corporate income tax rate to 12.5% from 35%, to eliminate capital gains taxes and in the estate tax would cost trillions more. Now, his biggest spending cut is a proposal to reduce funding for the more than 100 programs benefiting the poor. That would save an estimated cost of gasoline. And finally, we're looking at where these candidates stand on the threat of Iran. To be clear, we are comparing notes based on the answers the candidates gave in Wednesday night's CNN Republican debate in Arizona. We also have invited Hamilton County Republican Party Chairman Alex Triantafilou to join us tonight so we can really break down each of these three topics and what Ohio Republicans are looking for. But first, our $16 trillion debt. It's on the minds of a lot of voters. President Obama just unveiled his proposed $3.8 trillion budget, which includes about $1.7 trillion in deficit spending. It is the third consecutive budget that runs $1 trillion plus $2.4 trillion.
I put together a specific plan that cuts $5 trillion over 5 years, that spends less money each year for the next 4 years that I'll be President of the United States.
As for former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum's plan, well, according to the analysis, it would add $4.5 trillion. Santorum's plan would add to the deficit by reducing the number of individual income tax brackets to 2 from 6, with rates set at 28% and 10%. He would also eliminate the corporate income tax for manufacturers while cutting it to 17.5% for other businesses. Now, those proposals would together divert. Well, good evening. I'm Ben Swann, and welcome to this special half-hour reality check. We are just about 10 days away from Super Tuesday and the Ohio Republican primary. And that is why tonight we are giving you a look at the positions of the 4 Republican candidates and where they stand on 3 major issues. Now, throughout the evening, you can tweet comments about this program to @Fox19BenSwann. I'll respond to some of those tweets throughout the evening as well. Now, we are taking a look at a new report on each of the candidates' proposed budgets, how they plan to cut the national debt, as well as the ongoing federal deficit. We're also talking about gas prices and what these candidates propose to do about the soaring dollar deficit. So where do Republican candidates stand on their plans, and how would they reduce that deficit? Let's take a look. Four Republican candidates and 4 different economic spending plans. A new report released by the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget in Washington has run the numbers, and here's what they found. All but one candidate's plan would actually increase the deficit.
Well, when I was Speaker, as I'm sure he remembers, we balanced the budget for 4 consecutive years for the only time in his lifetime.
Let's start with former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. His plan would add the